Between 1980 and 2010, the percentage of Americans incarcerated in this country tripled. But here in Montana, we witnessed an even greater jump. We wanted to know what's behind our exploding prison population. Some legal analysts point to mandatory minimum laws enacted in the 1980s. For example, since the 1986 Drug Abuse Act, someone caught with 500 grams of powder cocaine and convicted in federal court will automatically serve at least 5 years in prison. Supporters of mandatory minimums say they create consistency in sentencing so that a judge can't give one person probation and another 20 years for the same crime. They also say the laws prevent people from using drugs and keep drug users off the streets. Critics argue mandatory minimums have undermined a judge's ability to use common sense and compassion in a sentencing and scare the potentially innocent into accepting plea deals. Tonight, we take an in-depth look at the case of Richard Flohr, a licensed medical marijuana provider in the state of Montana. In 2011, the feds raided his Miles City grow operation. Flohr was indicted on charges of conspiracy, marijuana manufacturing for distribution, money laundering, and firearm violations. Here's what happened after he decided to plead guilty instead of risk facing a minimum of 110 years in prison.
Who in this country deserves to die shackled to a bed over marijuana? Nobody.
Kristen Flohr's 68-year-old father, Richard, lived with a stage 5 aneurysm in his brain, collapsed discs in his back, a failing heart in his chest, and an elaborate medical marijuana farm in his home.
Believing he's complying with state law, believes the federal government when they say that if you comply with state law, we won't prosecute you. Believed everything he was doing was legal.
But it wasn't. In 2011, the feds busted Richard and 24 other medical marijuana providers. 2 of Flohr's partners pleaded guilty rather than face the mandatory minimum sentence that would accompany a conviction. Neither received prison time.
We took the position that Richard Flohr isn't going to survive jail time.
So Flohr's defense attorney cut a deal with federal prosecutors.
They made an agreement not to make any arguments at sentencing and assumed that the judge would not incarcerate somebody like that. Unfortunately, they forgot.
The U.S. Attorney's Office would not talk to me on camera, but confirmed via email that it did agree not to push for a specific sentence. But then, in a memo to Judge Charles Lovell, asked for 9 to 11 years.
I called him on it.
A spokeswoman told me the Assistant United States Attorney filed a notice with the court of the error and requested that the court disregard any reference to a specific sentencing recommendation. But Arndorfer argues the damage was done, convincing Lovell that federal prosecutors wanted Flohr in prison. His sentence? 5 years.
I was floored. When I was standing in the courtroom and the judge gave him jail time, I mean, you could have knocked me over with a feather. It was unbelievable to me.
He argues that mandatory minimums have made prosecutors the most powerful people in the justice system and created a culture in which some judges feel it's their job to put people in prison and keep them there.
The federal system has no rehabilitation goals at all.
I dug into data kept by the Bureau of Justice. In 1980, about 220 people out of every 100,000 Americans were incarcerated. By 2010, that number had more than tripled. An even bigger increase here in Montana. In 1980, 96 prisoners for every 100,000 people. In 2010, 376.
There's no compassion or individual look at who this person is or what they need.
The U.S. Attorney's Office disagrees, arguing Flohr's punishment fit his crime. They say he not only broke federal law by growing and selling marijuana, but also broke state law by selling to undercover DEA agents who were not medical marijuana patients, selling more than the maximum amount allowed, growing and selling hashish, and possessing and selling firearms illegally. Quote, despite Mr. Arndorfer's assertions, the culture of the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Montana is one rooted firmly in the pursuit of justice. The individuals that prosecute cases in the District of Montana are some of the finest lawyers in the state of Montana. Any assertion that their tireless efforts in enforcing federal law are directed by anything other than an innate sense of right and wrong is simply false. After Flohr's sentencing, Kristen begged Judge Lovell to release her father pending appeal. Floor now suffered from dementia and complained of unbearable pain. The judge said no.
My dad was half dead before they sentenced him.
3 months after his sentencing, Floor was dead. Kristen says he suffered 2 heart attacks, liver and kidney failure, and that upon autopsy, doctors found metastatic cancer in his colon. She called her mother, also in prison on marijuana charges, to break the news.
We got to bury Dad.
Lovell said in a statement, quote, "I was sorry to learn of the passing of Mr. Floor. Judicial ethics prohibit further response." One of the U.S. Senate's most powerful members recently threw mandatory minimum sentences into the spotlight. Just last month, Chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Patrick Leahy, called for an end to the laws. Leahy, a Democrat from Vermont, has not said whether he will call for hearings or new legislation on the issue. Regardless, some analysts say it's unlikely U.S. lawmakers will scale back mandatory minimums anytime soon. In fact, in 2012, Congress expanded the list of charges that trigger mandatory minimum sentences to include synthetic drugs.